Grab a tray. The catering staff is short. Corbin shoved a silver tray of empty champagne glasses into my hands. We stood in the center of the brightly lit ballroom. It was his tech company launch party. 300 elite investors and guests watched us. "Don't just stand there, my father Arthur," snapped. He stepped in front of Corbin, physically blocking me from the investors. "Do what your brother says. You're embarrassing him. You don't belong here anyway." They made me stand by the kitchen doors for 2 hours. They treated me like the hired help. They laughed at my silence. They thought I was weak. They thought I was broken. That was 6 months ago. Today, they are laughing at me again. But we are not at a party. We are in a courtroom. "No lawyer," my brother said loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. A few people chuckled. My father smiled. Their attorney leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had already decided how the day would end. I stood alone at the defense table. No lawyer, no family beside me, no one whispering encouragement in my ear. I just stared at them. I kept my mouth shut. I kept my hands flat on the wooden desk. They thought my silence was fear. They didn't know I spent the last 10 years running military fraud investigations. They didn't know I already had the bank logs. My name is Maeve. I am 32 years old. I am a commissioned officer in the United States Army. Most people who meet me see a calm woman with a controlled voice and careful posture. They see someone polite, disciplined, and quiet. What they do not see are the years that created that silence. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. I lived with my father and my older brother, Corbin. In our house, there was one simple rule. Corbin mattered. I did not. Nobody ever said those exact words, but they didn't have to. You learn things through repetition. Corbin forgot to do his chores. He was tired. I forgot to do mine. I was irresponsible. Corbin got a C on a test. School wasn't for everyone. I got an A-. Why wasn't it an A? The older I became, the clearer the pattern became. My father worshipped my brother. He called him his legacy, his future, the son who would carry the family name. I was simply the daughter, the backup child, the one expected to help without being noticed. 4 years ago, that dynamic reached its peak. I was severely injured during a military deployment. A shattered leg. I spent 8 months in a military rehabilitation clinic. I underwent 3 surgeries. I learned how to walk again through intense, agonizing physical therapy. During those 8 months, my father visited me exactly once. He stayed for 20 minutes. He looked at his watch the entire time. Then his phone rang. It was the police station. Corbin had been arrested for driving under the influence. My father stood up immediately. He grabbed his coat, told me to get well soon, and left to bail Corbin out. He paid a $10,000 bond that same night. I spent the next 7 months recovering alone in a sterile white room. I stopped expecting him to care. I stopped asking. The only person who ever truly saw me was my grandfather, Colonel Harrison. He was a retired Army officer, a Vietnam veteran. A man who rarely raised his voice because he never needed to. He had a way of looking at people that made them tell the truth. I remember one specific afternoon. I was 13 years old. I was sitting alone behind his garage. My father had just spent 20 minutes explaining why Corbin deserved a new truck and I didn't deserve a scholarship celebration dinner. Grandpa sat beside me and handed me a bottle of root beer. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he asked, "You know why they're wrong about you?" I shrugged. He smiled. "Because they're measuring you with the wrong ruler." I never forgot that sentence. When I turned 18, I enlisted. My father hated the decision. He stood in the kitchen and yelled at me. "You're throwing your life away. You'll quit in 6 months. You don't belong in the military." I stood perfectly still, listening to him. Then Grandpa quietly stood up from the table. "Funny," Grandpa said. "You said the same thing about me." The room became silent. That was the first time I ever saw my father lose an argument. The Army changed my life. It wasn't easy. Basic training was brutal. The deployments were harder. The sacrifices were endless. But for the first time in my life, effort mattered. Results mattered. Discipline mattered. Nobody cared whether I was someone's daughter. Nobody cared whether my father approved of me. The uniform didn't care. The mission didn't care. I loved that. Over the next decade, I built a career. Promotions came, awards came. Responsibilities grew. I specialized in financial investigations. I tracked missing funds, exposed contractor fraud, and built cases against corrupt officials. I handled millions of dollars in federal assets. My father barely acknowledged any of it. When I became an officer, he changed the subject. When I received commendations, he talked about Corbin. Corbin, meanwhile, bounced between failed business ventures, failed investments, and failed relationships. Each time he fell, my father rushed to rescue him. Money, excuses, second chances, third chances. The pattern never changed. Then, Grandpa suffered a stroke. I received the call on a Tuesday. By the time I arrived at the hospital, he was conscious but very weak. I sat beside his bed for hours. The monitors beeped rhythmically in the background. My father and Corbin were out in the hallway, drinking coffee, complaining about the hospital parking fees. At one point, Grandpa squeezed my hand. "Still carrying the family on your back," he whispered. I laughed through tears and said I was trying. He smiled. "Good." That was the last real conversation we ever had. 2 weeks later, he passed away. The funeral brought everyone together, at least physically. Corbin spent most of the service checking his phone. My father accepted condolences like a politician greeting voters. I stood beside the casket. I remembered the only man who had ever believed in me before I believed in myself. A week later, we gathered for the reading of the will. We sat in a cold, glass-walled conference room at a downtown law firm. Corbin sat across from me, playing with his car keys. My father checked his watch. The attorney walked in, sat down, and opened a thick leather binder. He began calmly. He listed a few personal items, some charitable donations, and family keepsakes. Then, everything changed. The attorney cleared his throat. He announced that the largest asset in Grandpa's estate was a substantial investment portfolio and several properties accumulated over decades. The total value was $5.2 million, far more than anyone expected. Corbin dropped his keys. My father sat up straight. The attorney adjusted his glasses. Then he read Grandpa's final decision. The entirety of the $5.2 million estate would go to me. Not Corbin, not my father, me. The room froze. Corbin actually laughed. He looked around the table, waiting for the punchline. He thought it was a joke. Then he realized it wasn't. My father's face turned completely red. "What?" he demanded. The attorney repeated himself. Corbin stood up, knocking his chair back. "This is ridiculous." My father pointed a finger directly at my face. "You manipulated him." The accusation hit the room like a gunshot. I stared at him. "You don't actually believe that," I said quietly. He slammed his fist on the table. "Oh, I do." The attorney attempted to calm everyone down. It didn't work. By the time the meeting ended, my father and brother were already discussing legal action. 3 weeks later, they filed suit. They claimed undue influence, manipulation, fraud. They wanted the will invalidated. They wanted everything. But they did not just file a lawsuit. They set a trap. They wanted to starve me out. 2 days after they filed the suit, I went to the grocery store. My debit card declined. I tried a different card. Declined. I walked out of the store, sat in my car, and called my bank. The representative put me on hold for 10 minutes. When she returned, her voice was tight. "Ma'am, your accounts have been frozen under a preliminary court injunction." I demanded to know how. She explained that a medical proxy, allegedly signed by my grandfather months before his death, granted Corbin temporary executor rights to freeze all assets connected to the estate, including my personal accounts. Since Grandpa had once transferred $1,000 to me for my birthday, Corbin had forged a medical proxy. He used it to lock my money. He knew attorneys required massive retainer fees up front. He wanted to ensure I could not afford legal representation. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to call him and beg for a settlement. He forgot one thing. In the military, when the enemy cuts off your supply lines, you do not surrender. You start hunting. I drove back to my apartment. I did not cry. I did not call my father. I walked into my home office, locked the door, and opened my military-issued laptop. I accessed federal financial databases. I pulled property records, tax filings, and wire transfer histories. I spent 72 hours awake. I drank black coffee and built a timeline. I tracked every single penny that moved in and out of my grandfather's accounts over the last 5 years. I found the truth. It was worse than I thought. Much worse. I compiled a 300-page dossier. I printed every document. I highlighted every discrepancy. I placed everything into 3 heavy folders. I informed the court that I would represent myself. When my father heard that, he laughed. Corbin laughed even harder. They hired attorney Sterling. He was one of the most successful probate attorneys in the state. His hourly rate was $600. The morning of the trial felt strangely ordinary. The sky above the courthouse was gray. A light wind pushed fallen leaves across the parking lot. People hurried through the entrance carrying coffee cups and briefcases. For them, it was just another workday. For me, it was the day my family intended to erase everything my grandfather had chosen to leave behind. I parked my car. I sat quietly for a moment and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked calm. Years in uniform had taught me something valuable. Fear and confidence often look exactly the same from the outside. The difference exists only inside your head. I gathered my documents, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked toward the courthouse. My father's truck was already there. So was Corbin's luxury SUV, the one he definitely couldn't afford. As I entered the building, I spotted them immediately. Corbin stood beside Sterling. Sterling wore a bespoke navy suit. Corbin noticed me first. A grin spread across his face. "Well, look who's here." My father turned. Neither of them greeted me. Neither of them asked how I was doing. Neither of them acted like I was family. Sterling looked me over. "Professional, polite, confident, Miss Carter," he said. I nodded. "Mr. Sterling, I understand you've chosen to represent yourself," he continued. "I have," I replied. There was a brief pause. The kind people use when they're deciding how much honesty is appropriate. Finally, he said, "That is certainly your right." It was a polite translation for, "You're making a terrible mistake." I almost smiled. Instead, I simply said, "Thank you." Corbin laughed. "You hear that? Even he thinks you're crazy." I ignored him. Years ago, comments like that would have hurt. Not anymore. The courtroom filled slowly. By 9 a.m., nearly every seat was occupied. Some people were curious. Others were connected to the estate. I could feel eyes following me. People notice when one side has a high-powered attorney and the other side has nobody. Or at least, that's what they thought. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. Judge Thorne entered. I had researched him extensively. He was a former prosecutor, from a military family, known for being fair but exceptionally difficult to fool. He settled into his chair, reviewed several documents, and looked up. The proceedings began. Sterling immediately took control of the room. He was very good. His voice carried authority without sounding aggressive. His questions seemed reasonable. His argument sounded logical. Watching him work, I understood why my father had hired him. Sterling's strategy became obvious almost immediately. He wasn't trying to prove that my grandfather had been incompetent. That would have been difficult. Instead, he intended to convince the court that I had influenced an elderly man during a vulnerable period of his life. A much easier argument, especially because I had spoken with Grandpa frequently during his final years. The first witness was one of Grandpa's neighbors, Mrs. Reynolds. She was an elderly woman who had known him for decades. Sterling guided her carefully. "Did Maeve visit often?" he asked. "Yes," Mrs. Reynolds replied. "More often than the other family members." "Would you say they were close?" "Very close." Sterling nodded thoughtfully. "Did Mr. Harrison ever discuss changing his will?" Mrs. Reynolds hesitated. "A few times after Maeve's visits became more frequent. Yes." Sterling allowed silence to linger. The implication hung in the air. He didn't need to say it. Everyone understood what he wanted them to think. The second witness was a family acquaintance, then another. Each testimony was subtle, nothing dramatic, just small pieces arranged into a larger picture. Maeve spent time with Grandpa. Maeve called Grandpa. Maeve visited Grandpa. Therefore, Maeve must have manipulated Grandpa. It was clever. During cross-examination, I stood up. I walked to the podium. I asked Mrs. Reynolds only 3 short, simple questions. "Mrs. Reynolds, did you ever see me physically hand my grandfather a legal document?" "No." "Did you ever hear me mention money in his presence?" "No." "Thank you." I sat down. That surprised people. I could feel it. Most self-represented litigants talked too much, argued too much, panicked too much. I did none of those things. I listened. I took notes. I waited. By lunchtime, my father looked pleased. Corbin looked ecstatic. He leaned back in his chair like a man already spending money he hadn't won yet. When the judge called for a recess, Corbin practically bounced out of his seat. Outside the courtroom, I found a quiet bench near a window overlooking the city. I opened a bottle of water and reviewed my notes. A shadow appeared beside me, Judge Thorne. For a moment, I thought he was simply passing by. Instead, he stopped. "Miss Carter," he said. I stood. "Your Honor." He studied me carefully. Not suspiciously, curiously. "May I ask you a question?" "Of course." His gaze remained fixed on me. "Why are you representing yourself?" The question wasn't hostile. It sounded genuine. I considered my answer. I thought about telling him about the frozen bank accounts. I thought about telling him that Corbin forged a medical proxy. But that was for the trial. So, I told him the absolute truth. "Because this isn't really about money," I said. His eyebrow lifted slightly. "No?" "No, sir." I looked through the window toward the parking lot. "My father and brother have spent my entire life telling me who I am." The judge remained silent. They never listened when I spoke. I turned back toward him. "This time, they're going to have to." Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then Judge Thorne nodded once. A very small movement, but something about it felt significant. He glanced down at the file tucked beneath his arm. A thick file. My file. I noticed several pages marked with colored tabs. His expression changed slightly, as though he had remembered something. Then he looked back at me. "You seem remarkably calm," he said. I smiled faintly. Occupational hazard. That earned the smallest hint of amusement. Indeed, the bailiff called everyone back inside. The judge paused before walking away. "Courtrooms have a way of revealing things people work very hard to hide," he said. The afternoon session began. Sterling intensified his attack. He introduced financial records, phone logs, travel records. Every document was designed to suggest influence. Every exhibit was carefully chosen. My father watched with satisfaction. Corbin barely concealed his excitement. Finally, near the end of the day, Sterling delivered his strongest argument. He approached the center of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this case is not complicated." He turned toward me. An elderly man changed the distribution of a multi-million-dollar estate. He paused. The primary beneficiary was the family member who spent the most time with him. Another pause, and that beneficiary now sits alone at that table. His eyes moved deliberately across the room. No legal counsel. No professional representation. No independent verification of her claims. He spread his hands. The gesture practically screamed victory. Then he sat down. The courtroom fell silent. I looked across the room. Corbin met my eyes. The grin returned. Slow, arrogant, cruel. He leaned toward me and spoke softly. "No lawyer," he chuckled. "You're finished." What neither he nor my father noticed was the judge. Because at that exact moment, Judge Thorne wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my personnel file. And the expression on his face had completely changed. Tomorrow, they were going to learn exactly who I was. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early. Old habits die hard. In the Army, being on time meant arriving before everyone else. Anything less was late. The hallway outside courtroom 3 was nearly empty. A janitor pushed a cart past the entrance. A clerk carried a stack of files toward another office. Everything felt calm, ordinary. It was difficult to believe that within an hour, my entire family would begin unraveling. I sat quietly at the defense table. I placed my 3 heavy folders on the wooden surface. I arranged my pens. I waited. When my father and Corbin entered, they looked energized, confident. The previous day had gone exactly the way they wanted. Their witnesses had performed well. Their attorney had controlled the room. I had spent most of the proceedings listening. To them, silence looked like weakness. That misunderstanding was about to become very expensive. Corbin dropped into his chair across the aisle. He smirked. "Sleep well?" he asked. I did not answer. My father laughed softly. "Reality is finally setting in." I still said nothing. People reveal a great deal when they think they have already won. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the bailiff called the court to order. Everyone stood. Judge Thorne entered. He sat down. Something immediately felt different. The judge was not carrying the same file from yesterday. He was carrying two. One was the estate case. The other was much thicker. I recognized it instantly. It was my personnel record, not the public version, the complete unredacted version. A file that contained years of evaluations, certifications, commendations, and government documentation. My pulse quickened slightly, not from fear, from realization. The judge had done his homework. Across the aisle, Attorney Sterling seemed to notice the file as well. His expression tightened for a fraction of a second, then the proceedings began. Sterling stood up. Your Honor, before we proceed, the plaintiffs respectfully move for summary judgment regarding several evidentiary matters. We believe the evidence already presented clearly demonstrates undue influence. Judge Thorne nodded. Go ahead. Sterling launched into a carefully prepared argument. He spoke for 10 minutes. Every sentence reinforced the same idea. Maeve manipulated an elderly man. Maeve benefited from that influence. Maeve had no legal basis to challenge the evidence. When he finished, he looked satisfied. The room remained silent. Then, Judge Thorne turned toward me. Miss Carter? Yes, Your Honor. Do you wish to respond? I stood up. I do. I walked toward the podium. No notes, no prepared speech, just facts. Over the years, I had testified in military proceedings, administrative hearings, and federal command inquiries. The setting was different today, but the pressure was not. For 5 minutes, I addressed each of Sterling's claims directly, methodically, without a single drop of emotion. When I finished, I returned to my seat. Sterling appeared unimpressed. Corbin looked amused. My father looked relieved. Then, Judge Thorne began reviewing documents one by one. The courtroom waited. 30 seconds passed. 60 seconds. 90 seconds. Finally, Judge Thorne removed his glasses. Mr. Sterling. The attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tapped the thick personnel file on his desk. What exactly is your position regarding Miss Carter's ability to represent herself? Sterling hesitated. The question surprised him. My position? Yes. Sterling adjusted his jacket. I believe self-representation places her at a significant disadvantage in a complex probate matter. Judge Thorne nodded slowly. I see. Then he opened the thick file. The sound of turning pages echoed through the quiet room. One page, then another, then another. His eyes moved steadily down the documents. Suddenly, he looked directly at the plaintiff's table. She doesn't need a lawyer. The sentence landed like a hammer. Nobody moved. Corbin blinked. What? My father frowned. Sterling stared at the judge. Your Honor, I don't understand. Judge Thorne continued reading. She possesses extensive legal training. Silence. The judge turned another page. She has completed advanced military legal education. Another page. She has led federal investigations involving financial misconduct and large-scale fraud. Another page. She has testified under oath in numerous official proceedings handling assets exceeding $20 million. The room was completely still now. Even the spectators had stopped shifting in their seats. Judge Thorne looked directly at Sterling. According to this file, Miss Carter has spent years handling matters significantly more complex than this probate dispute. She is fully capable. I watched Sterling's face. The confidence vanished. It was replaced by sudden, sharp recognition. He reached for his copy of the preliminary background check his firm had run on me. His eyes moved rapidly. He realized his firm had only pulled a basic civilian background check. They had not accessed the restricted federal database. His face lost all color. Oh my God, Sterling whispered. The words escaped his mouth involuntarily. Corbin turned toward him. What? What is it? Sterling did not answer Corbin. He looked at me. He looked at my 3 folders. Then he looked back at his client. Look at her record, he hissed through his teeth. My father leaned forward. What record? Sterling swallowed hard. I could see his mind racing, recalculating the entire case. Every assumption, every strategy, every prediction was instantly destroyed. Because for the first time, he was not looking at me as a weak, helpless daughter. He was looking at my professional history. Judge Thorne spoke again. Counsel, I suggest you proceed with the understanding that Miss Carter is fully aware of the rules of evidence. Call your next witness. Yes, Your Honor. Sterling's voice shook slightly. The proceedings resumed. The illusion had cracked. The image my family had built of me over decades was beginning to collapse. Sterling called his next witness. Mrs. Reynolds, the elderly neighbor from yesterday, returned to the stand. Sterling conducted a brief redirect examination, trying to stabilize his narrative. He had her repeat her claim that I was constantly at the house, pressuring my grandfather. Then, he sat down. Judge Thorne turned to me. Cross-examination, Miss Carter? Yes, Your Honor. I stood up. I picked up my first folder. I walked toward the witness stand. Mrs. Reynolds smiled nervously. Mrs. Reynolds, I began, my voice flat. Yesterday, you testified that my grandfather discussed changing his will after my visits became more frequent. You claimed I was constantly at his house pressuring him. Is that correct? Yes, she said. You are certain? Yes. I saw you. Can you tell the court the exact dates those conversations and visits occurred? She hesitated. Sterling stood up. Objection. The witness has already provided approximate time frames. Overruled, Judge Thorne said. The witness will answer. Mrs. Reynolds gave 4 specific dates. March 12th, April 5th, August 19th, September 2nd of the previous year. I wrote them down on a whiteboard facing the jury box. I turned back to her. Mrs. Reynolds, do you know where I was on those specific dates? She looked confused. You were at the house. I saw your car. I opened my folder. I pulled out a stack of stamped, sealed documents. I handed a copy to the bailiff, a copy to Sterling, and the original to Judge Thorne. Your Honor, I submit Defense Exhibit A into evidence. Official United States military deployment orders and travel logs. Judge Thorne reviewed them. Sterling reviewed them. I handed a copy to Mrs. Reynolds. Mrs. Reynolds, I said, pointing to the paper in her hands. Please read the location listed for March 12th. She squinted at the paper. Kabul, Afghanistan. Read the location for April 5th. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Frankfurt, Germany. Read August 19th and September 2nd. She swallowed hard. Tokyo, Japan. I stepped closer to the stand. On every single date you just swore under oath that you saw me at my grandfather's house in Ohio, I was thousands of miles away on active military duty. I did not even set foot in the United States during those months. The woman stared at the paper. Her hands began to shake. I must have remembered wrong. The car looked like yours. You must have, I said coldly. A murmur spread through the courtroom. I turned toward the plaintiff's table. Corbin's jaw was clenched tight. My father looked away. Did my grandfather ever actually tell you I pressured him? I asked. No. Did you ever witness me pressure him? No. Then your testimony is based entirely on fabricated assumptions. Mrs. Reynolds looked down at her lap. Tears welled in her eyes. Yes. No further questions. I returned to my seat. The damage was immediate. 1 witness, 5 minutes. Sterling rubbed his forehead. I saw real doubt in his eyes now, not just about the case, but about his own clients. He was beginning to realize Corbin and Arthur had lied to him. But I was not finished. Call your next witness, Judge Thorne ordered. Sterling stood up slowly. He looked at his list. He looked at Corbin. Then he called Nurse Brenda. Nurse Brenda was a private home care nurse who had visited my grandfather twice a week during his final months. She walked confidently to the stand. She swore the oath. Sterling approached her. Brenda, can you describe Mr. Harrison's mental state during your visits? Sterling asked. He was very confused, Brenda said smoothly. He often forgot where he was. He was easily manipulated. And did he ever mention his granddaughter, Maeve? Yes. He was terrified of her. He told me she was forcing him to sign papers. He said she yelled at him when they were alone. Sterling nodded. Thank you. No further questions. It was a damning testimony. If it were true, I stood up. I picked up my second folder. I did not walk to the podium. I walked directly to the projector in the center of the room. I connected my laptop. Nurse Brenda, I said, keeping my eyes on the screen. You testified that my grandfather was terrified of me, and that he was confused. That is correct. How long have you been employed by the private nursing agency? 4 years. What is your annual salary? Sterling jumped up. Objection. Relevance. I will establish relevance immediately, Your Honor, I said. Overruled. You may answer, the judge said. $45,000, Brenda answered. She looked defensive. I see. I pressed a button on my laptop. A bank statement appeared on the large screen behind me. It was highly magnified. Your Honor, I submit Defense Exhibit B, certified financial subpoenas. I pointed to the screen. Nurse Brenda, do you recognize this account number? She looked at the screen. Her confident posture vanished. Her face went slack. That is a joint account I hold with my husband. Yes, it is, I said. Now, please look at the transaction dated October 14th, exactly 2 weeks before this trial began. Read the incoming wire transfer amount. Brenda opened her mouth. No sound came out. Read it, I commanded. My voice echoed in the silent room. $15,000, she whispered. And can you read the name of the originating LLC that sent that $15,000 to your husband's account? She looked at Corbin. Corbin looked at the floor. Read the name, Judge Thorne instructed, his voice dangerously low. Apex Solutions LLC, Brenda cried out. Tears began streaming down her face. I clicked another button. A state business registration document appeared on the screen. Apex Solutions LLC, I read aloud. Registered owner and sole proprietor, Corbin Carter. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators gasped. Sterling physically stepped away from Corbin, looking at him with pure disgust. Corbin gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. My father stared at the screen, his mouth open. Judge Thorne slammed his gavel. Order! Order in this court! The room quieted down, but the tension was electric. I turned back to Brenda. Nurse Brenda, did Corbin Carter pay you $15,000 to commit perjury today? She broke down completely. She sobbed into her hands. He said nobody would check. He said it was just a family dispute. I have debts. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. No further questions. I disconnected my laptop. Judge Thorne glared at the witness stand. Bailiff, escort this witness to the holding area. I am referring this matter to the district attorney for immediate perjury charges. Brenda was led out of the courtroom crying. Sterling stood up. His hands were shaking. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of this transaction. I formally request a recess to confer with my clients. Denied, Judge Thorne snapped. You brought this case to my court, Mr. Sterling. We are finishing it today. Miss Carter, do you have your own evidence to present? I looked at my father. I looked at Corbin. They had tried to freeze my bank accounts to stop me. They had bought witnesses to frame me. They had spent my entire life breaking me down. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I have evidence. I opened my third folder, the parasite ledgers. I walked back to the projector. I connected the laptop again. The plaintiffs have repeatedly implied that my grandfather lacked the mental capacity to make independent decisions, and that I manipulated him for financial gain. The evidence shows otherwise. I clicked a button. Security footage from my grandfather's home office appeared on the screen. The timestamp rolled. It was dated 3 months before his death. The video had full audio. Grandpa walked into the room, slowly but steadily. He sat at his desk. He picked up his phone and dialed. Yes, David. It's Harrison. I need to update the trust structure. No, I know what I'm doing. Sell the municipal bonds. Move the liquid cash into the primary holding account. Yes, I'll be down tomorrow to sign the paperwork. He hung up, made notes in his ledger, and organized his files. Nothing about him suggested confusion. Nothing suggested incompetence. Nothing suggested vulnerability. He was sharp, commanding, and fully in control. I let the video play for 3 minutes. Judge Thorne watched carefully. The spectators watched. Sterling watched. The image being presented by my father's side collapsed frame by frame. I stopped the video. My grandfather was entirely lucid. He managed his own accounts until the week he died. Now, let us examine exactly why he chose to leave those accounts to me. I pulled up a master spreadsheet. I had spent 3 days building it. It tracked 8 years of banking history. Over the course of 8 years, I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, My grandfather provided financial assistance to multiple family members. Let us look at the totals. I displayed the first column. Corbin Carter, Apex Solutions LLC. Failed tech startup. $50,000. Never repaid. Corbin sank lower in his chair. Corbin Carter, Horizon Investments. Failed real estate venture. $120,000. Never repaid. Spectators began whispering. Corbin Carter, credit card debt consolidation, personal vehicle loans, and legal fees. $280,000. Never repaid. I highlighted the bottom cell in bright red. Total funds extracted by Corbin Carter. $450,000. Corbin covered his face with his hands. I moved to the next column. Arthur Carter, I announced. My father flinched. Personal loan, 2019. $40,000. Personal loan, 2020. $60,000. Unexplained cash withdrawals authorized from Grandpa's secondary checking account between 2021 and 2023. $150,000. I highlighted the bottom cell. Total funds extracted by Arthur Carter. $250,000. Much of which was used to cover hidden gambling debts he kept from the rest of the family. My father stared at the screen. He looked like he was suffocating. I turned toward the plaintiff's table. Would either plaintiff like to dispute these documents? They are certified by the Federal Banking Commission. Neither man spoke. They couldn't. Every time Corbin failed, Grandpa paid, I said, my voice rising slightly. Every time my father needed to save face, Grandpa paid. And according to the records, not a single cent was ever returned. I pressed the next button. Emails appeared on the screen. Most of these emails are harmless, I explained. But buried among them were messages between Arthur and Corbin Carter. Messages neither of them expected anyone to find. They were sent 2 weeks before my grandfather passed away, while he was in the hospital. I read the first email aloud. It was sent from Corbin to Arthur. Dad, we need to get him to sign the new proxy before he gets worse. If he leaves the main estate to Maeve, we're screwed. The bank is asking about the Apex loans. I read the reply from Arthur. I know. Keep Maeve out of the hospital room. Tell the nurses she isn't allowed in. I'll get the paperwork in front of him tomorrow. He's weak enough now. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The pure malice, the premeditated greed, was projected in black and white on a 10-foot screen. Sterling slowly closed his eyes and shook his head. He had been played for a fool. They did not file this lawsuit because they loved my grandfather, I said, looking directly at the judge. They filed it because they had drained him dry while he was alive, and they were angry they couldn't drain him after he was dead. They froze my bank accounts to prevent me from fighting back. They bought a witness to lie under oath. They assumed I would just surrender because I have spent my entire life surrendering to them. I walked back to the podium. I picked up a small digital recorder. I have one final piece of evidence, Your Honor. It is an audio recording. It was taken by my grandfather's attorney during their final meeting to establish the will. I pressed play. I held the microphone to the speaker. Grandpa's voice filled the courtroom. It was older, softer, but unmistakably strong. The attorney's voice on the tape asked, Harrison, are you absolutely certain you want to exclude Arthur and Corbin entirely? It might cause a legal dispute. Grandpa laughed softly on the recording. A tired, knowing laugh. Let them dispute it, Grandpa said. Arthur is a coward. Corbin is a parasite. They have spent my money for 20 years. They have never earned a dime. Silence hung on the tape for a few seconds. Then Grandpa spoke again. His voice cracked with emotion. If anyone deserves it, Maeve does. She never asked me for anything. She never treated me like a bank account. My son broke that girl's heart 1,000 times, and she still put on a uniform to serve her country. I swallowed hard. Hearing that still affected me. Even years of military training couldn't stop the knot forming in my throat. Then came the sentence that ended everything. She loved me before she knew what I owned, Grandpa said. Give her everything. The recording ended. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence afterward felt enormous, heavy, crushing. Judge Thorne looked toward my father, then toward Corbin, then toward Sterling. Finally, he folded his hands on his desk. Counsel, Judge Thorne said. Sterling stood up slowly. He looked exhausted, defeated. like a man realizing his career might be in jeopardy just for being associated with this case. Yes, Your Honor, Sterling said. Do you wish to continue arguing undue influence? Judge Thorne asked. The question was a formality, a death blow. Sterling glanced at the screen. He looked at the emails. He looked at the bank ledgers. Then he looked at Corbin and Arthur. Neither man could meet his eyes. No, Your Honor, Sterling said. The plaintiffs rest. The words landed harder than any verdict. Corbin lowered his head. My father stared blankly at the table. For the first time in my life, neither of them looked powerful. They looked small, pathetic, broken. The execution was complete. Greed is a disease that blinds people to their own incompetence. Arthur and Corbin were so used to using Maeve as their punching bag that they never stopped to realize she was the smartest person in the room. What do you think is the worst part of this betrayal? The fact that they stole hundreds of thousands from the grandfather while he was alive? Or that they tried to frame Maeve for it after he died? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're ready to see the final, devastating twist that destroys Arthur completely, stick around for the conclusion. The courtroom remained frozen in the aftermath of my grandfather's voice. The audio recording had stopped playing minutes ago, but the words still echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Arthur is a coward. Corbin is a parasite. Give her everything. I stood at the projector, my hand resting on the wooden podium. I watched the people in front of me. I watched Attorney Sterling pack his expensive silver pen into his leather briefcase. His movements were slow, mechanical, and defeated. He did not look at his clients. He did not look at the judge. He only looked at his hands. He knew his reputation had just taken a massive, public hit. He had been manipulated by two desperate men, and he had blindly brought their lies into a federal judge's courtroom. Judge Thorne leaned back in his high leather chair. He took off his reading glasses and placed them deliberately on the stack of evidence I had provided. Corbin was staring at the floor, his face pale, his shoulders hunched. He looked at my father, Arthur. My father was gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. Mr. Sterling? Judge Thorne's voice cut through the heavy silence. It was sharp, cold, and carried absolute authority. Sterling stood up immediately. He straightened his suit jacket, but the confident swagger from yesterday was entirely gone. Yes, Your Honor. You have formally rested your case, Judge Thorne stated. It was not a question. We have, Your Honor. The plaintiffs have no further evidence to present, and we will not be calling any additional witnesses to the stand. Sterling's voice was tight. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to escape the room. Judge Thorne turned his attention to the center of the room. Based on the overwhelming documentary evidence, the certified financial records, the military deployment logs, and the audio testimony of the deceased, I am prepared to issue my ruling from the bench. A collective breath was drawn in the spectator gallery. People leaned forward. The clerk stopped typing. This court finds absolutely no basis for the plaintiff's claims of undue influence, coercion, fraud, or mental incapacity, Judge Thorne announced. His voice was a hammer driving nails into a coffin. The evidence presented today strongly indicates the exact opposite. It indicates a systematic, calculated, and malicious attempt by the plaintiffs to defraud this estate and manipulate the judicial system for their own financial gain. My father closed his eyes. Corbin buried his face in his hands. Therefore, Judge Thorne continued, raising his voice slightly so it reached every corner of the room. The last will and testament of Harrison Carter shall remain fully valid, intact, and enforceable as written. The plaintiff's petition to invalidate the will is hereby denied in its entirety. The gallery broke into a low murmur of whispers. Judge Thorne raised his hand, demanding silence. The room instantly quieted. Furthermore, the court finds this lawsuit to be entirely frivolous and filed in bad faith. The plaintiffs, Arthur Carter and Corbin Carter, are hereby ordered to bear absolute responsibility for all court costs, administrative fees, and any associated legal expenses incurred during this action. The temporary injunction freezing the defendant's personal bank accounts is lifted immediately. Judge Thorne picked up his wooden gavel. He raised it. For most people, that would have been the end. The case was closed. The decision was entered into the public record. The victory was absolute. Everyone could go home. But I was not most people. And I was not finished. Your Honor, I spoke clearly, my voice projecting across the room before the gavel could fall. Judge Thorne paused. The gavel hovered in the air. He looked down at me from the bench. Yes, Miss Carter, the court has ruled in your favor. Is there an administrative matter you need to address? There is one final matter, Your Honor, I said. I have one additional request regarding the financial disclosures connected to this family. The room went dead silent again. Sterling frowned, looking utterly confused. He glanced at my father, but my father looked just as lost. Corbin raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and wide with fresh panic. Proceed, Miss Carter, Judge Thorne said, lowering the gavel slowly. I walked back to the defense table. I reached into my briefcase. I had brought 3 heavy folders to the courtroom today. I had used 2. I now pulled out the 3rd folder. It was a thick, red manila envelope, sealed with tape. I had intentionally saved it until the very end. Because unlike the inheritance dispute, this was not about my grandfather. This was not about revenge for being treated poorly. This was about criminal accountability. I broke the seal. I pulled out 3 copies of a heavily documented financial report. I handed 1 copy to the bailiff to deliver to the judge. I handed the 2nd copy to Sterling. I kept the 3rd copy for myself. What exactly is this, Miss Carter? Judge Thorne asked, adjusting his glasses and opening the folder. Those are financial disclosures and property records, Your Honor, I said, standing tall at the center podium. But they are not connected to my grandfather's estate. Sterling was flipping frantically through the pages. He looked at the bank logos, the state seals, the mortgage stamps. Your Honor, I must object. If this is not related to the Harrison Carter estate, it has no bearing on this proceeding. I will allow the defendant to establish relevance, Judge Thorne said, his eyes scanning the first page of the document. Continue, Miss Carter. I looked directly at my father. He was staring at the red folder in my hands. A new kind of fear was blooming in his eyes. He didn't know what I had, but he knew I did not make mistakes. 16 years ago, I began, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. My mother, Evelyn Carter, passed away. Before she died, she established a private, hidden trust fund. It was not a large trust, but it was anchored by a piece of real estate, a childhood home she inherited from her own parents. According to the original trust documents, which are included in your folder on page 4, that property was to be held in trust until I turned 35 years old, at which point the deed would transfer entirely to me. My father's face went completely ashen. The blood literally drained from his cheeks. He opened his mouth, but his throat seized up. No sound came out. Arthur? Sterling whispered to him, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Arthur, what is she talking about? My father ignored him. He was paralyzed, staring at me as if I were holding a loaded weapon. Because I was a minor when she passed away, my father, Arthur Carter, was named as the temporary custodian and trustee of that specific fund, I continued, directing my attention back to the judge. His only legal duty was to maintain the property and pay the annual property taxes until the trust matured. Judge Thorne turned to page 4. He read the trust mandate. He nodded. I see the provision here. The language is very clear. Go on. During the discovery phase of this current lawsuit, when I was tracking the funds my father secretly extracted from my grandfather's accounts, I noticed a discrepancy in Arthur Carter's credit reports, a massive influx of capital that did not match his income, nor did it match the money he stole from Grandpa. I instructed everyone to turn to page 12. On page 12, you will see a commercial bank loan application dated 4 years ago. It is a secondary mortgage application for $300,000. The collateral used to secure that loan was the property held in my mother's trust. Judge Thorne's jaw tightened. A trustee cannot leverage trust assets for a personal commercial loan without the beneficiary's consent. Exactly, Your Honor, I said. Which is why Arthur Carter forged my signature on the consent waiver. The gallery erupted. People gasped out loud. A reporter sitting in the back row started typing furiously on a laptop. Corbin grabbed his father's arm. Dad? Dad, tell me that isn't true. Tell me you didn't do that. Arthur shoved Corbin's hand away, but he still could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his suit jacket. Turn to page 15, Your Honor, I commanded the room. You will see the consent waiver. You will see a signature that spells my name. But you will also see a forensic handwriting analysis report provided by an independent, federally certified examiner. The signature is a complete forgery. Arthur Carter illegally mortgaged a property he did not own, using a trust he was sworn to protect, to secure a $300,000 cash loan. And where did those funds go, Miss Carter? Judge Thorne asked. The temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. The judge was no longer acting as a probate mediator. He was looking at a major felony. Page 22 shows the wire transfers, I answered smoothly. The funds were deposited directly into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. An account solely controlled by Arthur Carter. An account he used to pay off illegal gambling debts he accumulated over a decade of visiting underground casinos in Nevada. Sterling dropped his copy of the folder onto the table as if it were on fire. He physically took a step away from Arthur. He raised both of his hands in the air, looking directly at the judge. Your Honor, Sterling stammered, his voice loud and panicked. Let the record show that my firm had absolutely zero knowledge of these transactions, this trust, or these offshore accounts. We were retained strictly for the probate dispute. We are not, and will not, represent Arthur Carter in any criminal matters. Sterling was abandoning ship. He knew a sinking vessel when he saw one. Judge Thorne ignored the attorney. He placed his hands flat on the high bench and leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto my father. Mr. Carter, Judge Thorne said, the title was a weapon. Stand up. Arthur did not move. His legs refused to work. He was trembling violently. I said, stand up, sir, Judge Thorne commanded. Slowly, painfully, my father pushed himself up from the wooden chair. He looked like an old, broken man. He looked nothing like the towering, terrifying figure who had controlled my childhood. He looked small. You are currently under oath in my courtroom, Judge Thorne said, his voice deadly calm. I am going to ask you a direct question. Did you forge your daughter's signature to illegally leverage a protected trust fund? And did you hide those assets in an offshore account to pay illicit gambling debts? Arthur looked around the room. He looked at the locked wooden doors at the back. He looked at the bailiff standing near the exit with his hand resting on his utility belt. He looked at Corbin, who was staring at him with pure horror. Finally, he looked at me. He expected to see anger in my eyes. He expected to see rage. But I gave him nothing. I stood at the podium, perfectly straight, perfectly calm. I watched him the same way I watched a target on a military drone monitor. Cold, detached, final. Sir, Judge Thorne warned, answer the question. Arthur's voice was a weak, raspy whisper. I intended to pay it back. I just needed time. I was going to pay it back before she turned 35. It was a confession, spoken directly into the court microphone, recorded on the official judicial transcript. Judge Thorne did not yell. He did not show outrage. He simply nodded, picked up his pen, and signed a piece of paper on his desk. Bailiff, Judge Thorne said, confiscate the documents provided in Defense Exhibit C. Have the court clerk make certified copies. You are to immediately hand-deliver a copy of this entire dossier, along with the official transcript of this morning's confession, to the District Attorney's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. Yes, Your Honor, the bailiff said, stepping forward to collect the red folder from the judge's desk. Arthur Carter, Judge Thorne continued, looking down at my father. You came into this court attempting to use the justice system to steal from your daughter. Instead, you have handed the justice system a perfectly documented case of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. You are ordered to surrender your passport to the clerk of courts before you leave this building today. If you attempt to flee the jurisdiction, a federal warrant will be issued for your immediate arrest. Judge Thorne picked up his gavel. This court is adjourned. The gavel cracked against the sounding block. The sharp noise echoed like a gunshot. Judge Thorne stood up, turned around, and walked through the private wooden door behind the bench. The trial was over. The gallery erupted into noise. People stood up, talking loudly, pointing at the plaintiff's table. The court reporter packed up her machine. Sterling did not even say goodbye to his clients. He grabbed his briefcase, practically ran down the center aisle, and pushed his way out the double doors, desperate to distance himself from the radioactive fallout. I did not move immediately. I stood at the defense table. I neatly stacked my papers. I closed my laptop. I placed my pens back into my bag. I executed every motion with precise military discipline. There was no celebration. I did not pump my fist in the air. I did not smile. Real life rarely works like the movies. Victories, especially ones that involve destroying your own family, often feel quieter, heavier, and far more exhausting than people imagine. I zipped my briefcase closed and turned to leave. Maeva. I stopped. The voice was weak, broken, and desperate. I turned my head. My father was standing a few feet away from me. The courtroom was mostly empty now, except for a few clerks and Corbin, who was standing frozen near the plaintiff's table. My father took a slow step toward me. He looked terrible. His skin was gray, covered in a cold sweat. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps. "Maeve, please," he whispered, holding out a shaking hand. I looked at him carefully. The strange thing was that I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires energy. Anger requires passion. Years earlier, lying alone in a military hospital bed with a shattered leg while he bailed out my drunk brother, I had run out of that energy. There was nothing left inside me for this man, only a vast, cold emptiness. "You didn't have to do this," my father choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelids. "The trust, the police. You're going to send me to prison. I'm your father." "You stopped being my father a long time ago," I said softly. The words were not cruel, they were simply a statement of fact. He took another step closer. I never thought you would become this. So cold, so ruthless. "You never really looked at me," I replied. "You spent your whole life underestimating me. You forced me to become a soldier to survive this family. Now you are upset because the soldier is standing in front of you, and she is holding the weapon." His eyes lowered. He knew it was true. He had spent 30 years ignoring me, only to be destroyed by the very skills I developed to escape his shadow. The silence stretched between us. The hum of the courtroom air conditioner seemed deafening. Then, he whispered the words I had waited my entire childhood to hear. The words that would have meant the world to a 13-year-old girl sitting behind a garage holding a bottle of root beer. "I was wrong," my father said, his voice breaking into a sob. "I was wrong about you." 3 words. 3 words that were decades too late. I wish I could say they fixed everything. I wish I could say those words acted like magic, washing away the years of neglect, the blatant favoritism, the psychological abuse. They did not. Some wounds heal and leave clean scars. Other wounds destroy the tissue entirely. You don't heal, you just learn to live with the missing pieces. I looked at his tear-stained face. "I know," I said simply. I turned my back on him and started walking down the center aisle toward the exit. I made it exactly 5 steps before I heard the sound. It was a sharp, guttural gasp, followed immediately by a heavy, sickening thud. I stopped. I turned around. My father was no longer standing. He had collapsed onto the hard wooden floor of the courtroom. He was lying on his side, his hands clawing desperately at his chest, tearing at his expensive silk tie. His eyes were rolled back. His face was contorted in sheer, absolute agony. The stress, the public humiliation, the sudden realization of his impending criminal prosecution, and the loss of his entire life's false narrative had triggered a massive physical failure. "Dad!" Corbin screamed. It was a horrific, ear-piercing sound. Corbin rushed around the table and dropped to his knees beside my father. "Dad! Dad! Look at me! Wake up!" Corbin grabbed my father's shoulders, shaking him. Panic filled Corbin's voice. Real panic. Not the arrogance from the party, not the entitlement from the will reading, just raw, naked, animalistic fear. "Help him!" Corbin screamed, looking wildly around the empty courtroom. He looked at me, his face streaked with tears. "Maeve, do something! Call an ambulance! Help him!" The bailiff, who was standing near the door, immediately pulled his radio from his belt. "Code 3 in courtroom 3. We need a medical bus immediately. Suspected cardiac arrest. Hurry." I stood in the center aisle, my briefcase in my hand, completely frozen. I did not run to him. I did not drop to my knees. I did not cry. I stood and watched as my father gasped for air on the floor. I watched Corbin weep like a terrified child. For a brief, terrifying second, I wondered if I was a monster. I wondered if the military and the trauma had stripped away my humanity entirely. But as I watched him clutch his chest, all I could think about was the cold, sterile hospital room 4 years ago. I remembered the exact color of the ceiling tiles I stared at for 8 months while my leg was held together by titanium rods. I remembered the silence of that room when he walked out after 20 minutes. Seeing your father dying on a courtroom floor never feels normal. It is a tragedy. But it was a tragedy I was watching from the outside. I was a spectator to their destruction. Within 2 minutes, the heavy wooden doors burst open. 4 paramedics rushed into the room carrying bags of medical equipment and a portable defibrillator. They pushed Corbin out of the way. They ripped open my father's shirt. They began administering emergency trauma care. The room was a chaotic blur of shouting voices, tearing fabric, and the high-pitched whine of medical machinery. "Stand back, we need room," a paramedic yelled at Corbin. Corbin stumbled backward, falling against the wooden benches. He was hyperventilating, staring in horror as they strapped an oxygen mask over my father's face and loaded him onto a collapsible stretcher. They moved with incredible speed. Within 60 seconds, they were wheeling the stretcher down the center aisle, directly past me. Corbin followed right behind them, running. As he passed me, he stopped for a fraction of a second. He looked into my eyes. The arrogant golden child was gone. In his place was a broken, terrified man who suddenly realized he had no money, no lawyer, no father to bail him out, and no future. He had absolutely nothing. He didn't say a word. He just turned and ran after the stretcher, disappearing through the double doors. The courtroom was suddenly quiet again. The bailiff was writing notes on his clipboard. A janitor was already coming in to clean the scuff marks off the floor. I tightened my grip on my briefcase handle. I turned around, pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and walked out of the courtroom. I walked down the long marble hallway. I pressed the button for the elevator. I rode it down to the lobby. I walked past the security checkpoint, pushed through the revolving glass doors, and stepped outside. The afternoon sun hung low above the city skyline, casting long golden shadows across the concrete steps. The air was cool and crisp. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for 32 years was suddenly gone. I hadn't just won a lawsuit. I had survived a war. For years, I had chased my father's approval. I had worked harder, achieved more, sacrificed my body and my peace of mind, believing that eventually he would see me. I thought if I became an officer, if I became a successful investigator, if I proved my worth, he would finally respect me. I thought he would finally choose me over the brother who destroyed everything he touched. But standing there on the courthouse steps, watching the city traffic move through the busy streets, I finally understood the lesson my grandfather tried to teach me behind the garage all those years ago. The people who refuse to see your worth cannot give you your value. You cannot force toxic people to respect you by being perfect. You cannot buy their love by being successful. They are measuring you with a broken ruler, and if you spend your life trying to fit their measurements, you will break yourself in the process. I didn't need my father to tell me I was strong. I didn't need my brother to acknowledge my intelligence. I didn't need their permission to exist, to succeed, or to be happy. Sometimes, the most powerful victory isn't proving your abusers wrong. It isn't watching them collapse in a courtroom, or watching them lose all their money, or exposing their crimes to the world. The ultimate victory is finally realizing you never needed them to be right. I walked down the concrete steps, unlocked my car, and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. For the first time in my life, I was only looking forward. 6 months passed since the day my father collapsed on the courtroom floor. He did not die. The paramedics restarted his heart in the back of the ambulance. He spent 3 weeks in the intensive care unit under federal guard. The moment he was medically cleared and discharged, federal marshals placed him in handcuffs. The evidence I handed over to Judge Thorne was flawless. The district attorney and the FBI did not even need to conduct a prolonged investigation. My father had left a paper trail of wire fraud, identity theft, and offshore banking that practically guaranteed a conviction. I sat in the back row of a federal courthouse in Chicago for his sentencing hearing. The room was much larger and colder than the probate court. I wore a simple black suit. I sat alone. My father was led into the courtroom wearing a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists were chained to his waist. His hair had turned entirely white. The heart attack had stripped away his physical presence. He looked hollowed out, frail, and terrified. His high-priced defense attorney had long since abandoned him, replaced by a stressed public defender who looked at the clock more than he looked at his client. The federal judge did not show any mercy. My father was convicted of 2 counts of federal wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft for forging my signature on the trust documents. Arthur Carter, the federal judge announced, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. You abused your position as a trustee, defrauded your own daughter, and attempted to hide the proceeds in an offshore account. You showed zero remorse until you were caught. I sentence you to 72 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay full restitution to the victim. 72 months. 6 years. My father did not argue. He did not cry. He just stared at the wooden table in front of him. As the marshals pulled him up by his arms to lead him away, he turned his head and looked at the gallery. He found me sitting in the back row. We locked eyes for a few seconds. I gave him a single, slow nod, a confirmation that it was finally over. He lowered his head and shuffled through the side door. I never saw him again. But while my father's fate was sealed, Corbin's was still spiraling out of control. Without our father's stolen money to fund his lifestyle, Corbin's world disintegrated. The federal investigation into my father's offshore accounts triggered a secondary audit into Apex Solutions LLC, Corbin's fake company. The IRS seized his luxury SUV. The bank foreclosed on his downtown condo. Within 3 months of the probate trial, my brother was effectively homeless, sleeping on a friend's couch, and facing his own impending tax fraud charges. I, on the other hand, had officially taken possession of my grandfather's $5.2 million estate. I moved out of my small apartment and relocated to Grandpa's property, a sprawling 80-acre horse farm an hour outside the city. The farmhouse was old but structurally perfect. It had hardwood floors, a massive stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch overlooking the rolling green pastures. It was quiet. It was safe. It was the first time in my life I truly felt at home. During my second week at the farmhouse, I began clearing out Grandpa's study. The room smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco. I packed his books into boxes and organized his old military medals. As I moved a heavy mahogany bookcase away from the wall to dust behind it, I noticed a hollow sound under my boots. I pulled back the Persian rug. Set directly into the floorboards was a heavy, combination dial floor safe. I knelt down and touched the cold steel. I already knew the combination. Grandpa used the same 4 numbers for everything, the year he enlisted in the army. I spun the dial. Click, click, click. The heavy metal door popped open. The safe was empty. Grandpa had already transferred all his important documents and assets to the bank vault years ago. But staring into that empty black square in the floor triggered a memory. A very specific, very painful memory. I was 17 years old. I was working 30 hours a week at a local diner, scrubbing grease off plates and serving coffee to truck drivers to save money for a reliable used car so I could drive myself to college. Over 10 months, I had saved exactly $2,400 in cash. I kept it hidden in a shoebox under my bed because my father refused to co-sign a bank account for me. One afternoon, I came home from a double shift. My room was trashed. My mattress was pushed aside. The shoebox was empty. I ran downstairs in a panic. Corbin was sitting on the living room couch, wearing a brand new heavy gold chain around his neck and playing a brand new video game console. My father was reading the newspaper in his armchair. "Where is my money?" I had screamed, pointing at Corbin. Corbin didn't even look away from the television. "I don't know what you're talking about, loser." "You stole it! You stole my car money!" I lunged at him, tears of exhaustion and rage streaming down my face. My father stood up and grabbed my arm, yanking me backward. "Stop acting like a lunatic," he yelled. "Your brother didn't take your money. You probably misplaced it. You're completely irresponsible." "He's wearing it," I screamed, pointing at the gold chain. "He doesn't even have a job." "Enough," my father roared, pushing me toward the stairs. "I will not have you accusing your brother of being a thief under my roof. Get out of my sight." I locked myself in my room that night. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just sat on the floor, staring at the empty shoebox. Corbin got to keep the gold chain. I got to keep taking the bus. That was the exact moment I realized my family would happily watch me bleed to death if it meant Corbin didn't have to get his hands dirty. I snapped out of the memory. I looked down at the empty floor safe in Grandpa's study. I ran my fingers over the steel rim. A sudden, dangerous thought crossed my mind. Corbin knew about this safe. Years ago, during one of family Thanksgiving dinners, Grandpa had casually mentioned having a floor safe in the study. Corbin's eyes had lit up. He had spent the rest of the evening asking Grandpa what he kept in it. Grandpa, knowing exactly what Corbin was, had smiled and said, "Emergency funds. Lots of them." If Corbin was desperate, broke, and running out of options, he would remember that conversation. The next morning, the phone calls started. I was drinking coffee on the porch when my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I answered it. "Don't hang up," Corbin's voice hissed through the speaker. He sounded frantic, breathless, and unhinged. "What do you want, Corbin?" I asked calmly. "I need cash, Maeve. The IRS froze my last account. I have nothing. I can't even buy food. You have $5 million. You owe me. I don't owe you anything. Do not contact me again." "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Dad is in prison because of you. My life is ruined because of you. If you don't wire me $50,000 by tomorrow, I'm coming to the farm. I know about the safe in the study, Maeve. I know Grandpa kept bearer bonds and cash in there. You either pay me or I'm going to take what's mine." He hung up. Most people would have called the police immediately and filed a restraining order. But a piece of paper does not stop a desperate man. A restraining order is just a warning. I didn't want to warn my brother. I wanted to end him. I walked back inside the farmhouse. I did not call the local sheriff. Instead, I opened my laptop and contacted a private security firm run by former military contractors I had worked with overseas. I paid them a premium rate for immediate, same-day installation. By sunset, the farmhouse was a fortress. They installed high-definition infrared cameras at every entry point, hidden entirely from plain sight. They placed motion sensors along the perimeter fence and silent pressure alarms under the windowsills. All the data fed directly into a secure server routed to my laptop and cell phone. I did not reinforce the back door of the kitchen. I left the standard, easily breakable deadbolt exactly as it was. If you want to catch a rat, you have to leave the trap open. I spent the next 3 days waiting. I worked from the farmhouse, reviewing financial documents and monitoring the camera feeds. The weather turned brutal on the fourth night. A massive thunderstorm rolled across the plains. Lightning cracked the sky, and heavy rain pounded against the tin roof of the porch. It was the perfect night to commit a crime. The noise of the storm would cover the sound of breaking glass. At 1:14 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A silent alert. "Perimeter breach. Sector 4 back gate." I sat up in bed. I was fully dressed in dark cargo pants and a black hooded sweatshirt. I opened my laptop. The infrared camera feed showed a heat signature moving quickly through the driving rain. It was a man, wearing a heavy raincoat, carrying a crowbar. He moved clumsily, slipping in the mud, but he was heading straight for the back porch. "Corbin." I picked up my phone and dialed 911. 911, "What is your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "My name is Maeve Carter," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "There is an intruder actively breaking into my home at 4,420 Willow Creek Road. He is armed with a crowbar. I am alone in the house. Units are being dispatched immediately, ma'am. Are you in a safe room?" "Yes," I lied. "Please hurry." I hung up. I did not stay in the bedroom. I walked silently down the carpeted hallway and stepped into the shadows at the top of the main staircase. From there, I had a perfect view of the hallway leading to Grandpa's study. Downstairs, I heard the sharp, metallic crunch of the back door lock shattering. Corbin was not a professional. He was loud, sloppy, and reckless. The heavy wooden door slammed against the kitchen wall. I heard his wet boots squeaking against the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily. The thunder rolled outside, masking the sound of his movements, but I didn't need to hear him. I knew exactly where he was going. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness on the ground floor. The beam bounced frantically along the walls as Corbin moved past the living room and headed straight toward the study. I walked down the stairs, making absolutely no noise. 10 years of moving through hostile environments had taught me how to walk without shifting my weight onto the creaking floorboards. Corbin entered the study. He left the door wide open. I moved to the doorway and stood in the pitch-black hallway, watching him. Corbin was a frantic mess. He threw his wet hood back. He dropped the heavy steel crowbar onto Grandpa's mahogany desk with a loud clatter. He immediately dropped to his knees, shining his flashlight onto the floor. He shoved the Persian rug aside, exposing the steel combination dial of the floor safe. Come on, he muttered to himself, his voice trembling with adrenaline and greed. He didn't know the combination. He pulled a heavy hammer and a chisel out of his coat pocket. He placed the chisel against the steel hinges of the safe and raised the hammer. He was committing felony breaking and entering, armed burglary, and destruction of property. He was officially crossing the point of no return. He swung the hammer down. The metal clanged sharply. He swung again, harder. Sparks flew from the steel hinge. "It's not going to open that way, Corbin," I said. My voice cut through the dark room like a blade. Corbin screamed. He dropped the hammer, scrambled backward on his hands and knees, and scrambled to grab the crowbar off the desk. He spun around, shining the blinding beam of the flashlight directly into my face. I didn't flinch. I reached out and flipped the wall switch. The heavy crystal chandelier in the center of the study flared to life, flooding the room with brilliant, blinding light. Corbin squinted, shielding his eyes. When his vision adjusted, he stared at me. I was standing in the doorway, perfectly calm, my arms crossed over my chest. I wasn't holding a weapon. I didn't need one. "Maeve," Corbin gasped, lowering the crowbar slightly but keeping it gripped tight in his right hand. You were awake." "I've been awake for 3 days, Corbin. I've been waiting for you." He looked around the room frantically, realizing he was caught. But his desperation quickly morphed back into the arrogant entitlement that had defined his entire life. He tightened his grip on the steel crowbar. "I don't care," he snarled, taking a step toward me. "I don't care that you're awake. Open the safe, Maeve. Now, open it, or I swear to God I'll smash everything in this house, starting with you." I looked at the crowbar in his hand. Then I looked into his eyes. He wasn't going to hit me. He was a coward. He only attacked people when the legal system or our father was there to protect him. "You want the safe opened?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Open it!" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "It's my money. Grandpa was my family too. You stole everything from me." I slowly walked into the room. I didn't look at the crowbar. I didn't show an ounce of fear. I walked directly past him, feeling the heat radiating off his panicked body, and knelt beside the floor safe. "You think there's money in here, Corbin?" I asked, looking up at him. "You think Grandpa left stacks of cash hiding under the floorboards for you to steal?" "Shut up and open it." I spun the dial. Click, click, click. I grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled the heavy door open. Corbin immediately pushed past me, dropping to his knees. He shined his flashlight down into the dark, square hole. His face dropped. His eyes widened in absolute horror. The safe was entirely empty, except for a single piece of standard, white printer paper sitting at the bottom of the steel box. Corbin reached in with a trembling hand and pulled the paper out. He held it up to the light. It wasn't a bearer bond. It wasn't a check. It was a high-resolution, color photograph. It was a picture of a 17-year-old girl wearing a cheap diner uniform, holding a shoebox. Across the bottom of the photograph, printed in bold black ink, were the words, "I never misplaced the money." Corbin stared at the paper. His brain short-circuited. He looked at the paper, looked at the empty safe, and then looked at me. What is this?" he stammered, his voice breaking. "Where is the cash? Where is the money?" "There is no money, Corbin," I said, standing up and looking down at him. "Grandpa emptied this safe 10 years ago. I put that picture in there this afternoon, because I knew exactly how predictable you are. I knew you would break into this house. I knew you would bring a weapon. I knew you would threaten me." Corbin's face twisted in rage. He dropped the paper, grabbed the crowbar, and stood up, towering over me. "You set me up. You set a trap for your own brother." "You set the trap yourself," I replied coldly. "I just opened the door and watched you walk into it." Red and blue police lights suddenly flashed through the large windows of the study. The heavy wail of police sirens pierced through the sound of the rainstorm. Tires screeched to a halt on the gravel driveway outside. Corbin froze. The color drained from his face entirely. The crowbar slipped from his fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. "No," he whispered, looking out the window at the 3 police cruisers blocking his escape route. "No, no, no, no." Heavy footsteps pounded onto the wooden porch. "Sheriff's Department." A deep voice boomed from the kitchen. "Show yourself." Corbin fell backward against the mahogany desk. He looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute world-ending terror. The arrogance was completely eradicated. There was no father to bail him out. There was no lawyer to manipulate the system. He had just been caught committing armed burglary at a multi-million-dollar estate, caught on high-definition infrared cameras, with a crowbar lying at his feet. "Maeve, please," Corbin begged, tears streaming down his face, his voice reverting to a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please, tell them I had permission to be here. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. Please. We're family. I'm your brother." I looked at him. I remembered the diner money. I remembered the frozen bank accounts. I remembered the forged medical proxy. I remembered the courtroom. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us until I was inches from his face. "No lawyer," I whispered softly. "You're finished." Two sheriff's deputies burst into the study with their weapons drawn, flashlight beams cutting across the room. "Drop to the ground. Hands behind your back. Do it now," the lead deputy ordered. Corbin collapsed onto the floor. He didn't fight. He just sobbed hysterically as the deputy slammed a knee into his back and wrenched his arms backward. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed sharply in the room. "Are you unharmed, ma'am?" the second deputy asked me, lowering his weapon. "I am perfectly fine, officer," I said, stepping back to give them room. He broke in through the kitchen. "The security footage is already downloaded on my laptop for your report." They hauled Corbin to his feet. His face was covered in dust and tears. He couldn't even look at me as they dragged him out of the study, through the hallway, and out the front door into the pouring rain. I walked to the window and watched them push his head down and shove him into the back of the police cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut, locking him inside the cage. The cruiser pulled away, its red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement until it disappeared down the long country road, swallowed entirely by the dark storm. I stood in the quiet study. I looked at the broken deadbolt down the hall. I looked at the empty floor safe. I picked up the photograph of myself at 17 and threw it into the trash can. The house was finally silent, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't just feel safe. I felt free. I am your storyteller here. We've reached the end of Maeve's journey to freedom. We saw that forgiveness doesn't always mean staying, and sometimes, the most profound healing happens when we stop trying to fix people who are committed to being broken. Maeve didn't just win a lawsuit. She reclaimed her own value from people who had no right to hold it. As we close this chapter, what lesson can we take from Maeve's resilience for our own lives? Have you ever had to walk away from someone who refused to measure you by your true worth? Thank you for being part of this space where we heal through storytelling. If you value narratives that help us find strength, uncover life lessons, and heal from the patterns of the past, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We explore the complexities of human relationships every single week, and I would love to have you with us on this journey. See you in the next one.